February 7, 1943, somewhere off the coast of California. A small Navy patrol craft picks up a sonar contact, a possible Japanese submarine lurking beneath the surface. A young ensign gives the order to prepare a depth charge. Seconds later, a live explosive detonates far too close to the ship, and the entire vessel is thrown violently into the air. When the smoke clears, a 26-year-old officer named Kirk Douglas is lying on the deck with internal injuries that will quietly follow him for the rest of his life. Decades before Spartacus, before the Oscar nominations, before he became one of the most iconic faces in American film, Kirk Douglas nearly died in the Pacific, and almost nobody outside his closest circle knew the real extent of what happened that day. Let's get into it. Long before he was Kirk Douglas, he was Ishur Danilovich, born on December 9, 1916, in Amsterdam, New York, the son of Herschel and Brina Danilovich, poor Russian Jewish immigrants who had fled Belarus to escape anti-Semitic violence. His father worked as a ragman, hauling scrap and junk through the streets with a horse and cart, one of the lowest-paying, lowest-status jobs available in the small, upstate New York town. The family was desperately poor. Douglas later described going to school some days without shoes and eating onion sandwiches because there was nothing else in the house. He was the only son among 7 children, and from an early age, he understood that if he wanted a different life, he was going to have to build it himself. He clawed his way out through sheer persistence, wrestling and working odd jobs to pay his way through St. Lawrence University, then earning a scholarship to the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York City. It was there, in the late 1930s, that Ishur Danilovich formally became Kirk Douglas, a stage name built for a career he hadn't landed yet. He was still a struggling young actor with more ambition than opportunity when the country was pulled into World War II. In 1941, before America had even fully entered the war, Douglas enlisted in the United States Navy. He trained as a communications and gunnery officer specializing in anti-submarine warfare, a highly technical role that required him to understand sonar detection, depth charge deployment, and small vessel combat tactics. He was commissioned as an ensign, and unlike the glamorous image many people carry of naval officers serving aboard massive battleships, Douglas was assigned to something far smaller and far more dangerous in its own way. PC-139, a small patrol craft built specifically to hunt Japanese submarines prowling the American Pacific coastline. These patrol craft were not built for comfort. They were fast, lightly armored, and designed for one purpose: to locate enemy submarines using sonar, then attack them directly with depth charges before the submarine could strike American shipping lanes. It was tense, technical, high-stakes work carried out largely without the fanfare given to larger fleet engagements, but no less dangerous to the men aboard. Handling live depth charges was itself one of the more inherently dangerous jobs in the entire Navy, and not because of the enemy. These were massive explosive canisters packed with hundreds of pounds of TNT or similar explosives rolled off the stern or launched from side-mounted throwers designed to detonate at a preset depth underwater. The margin for error was razor-thin. A charge set too shallow, dropped too close to the ship, or triggered even seconds early could turn the weapon meant for the enemy submarine into a direct threat to the very crew launching it. Every man aboard a patrol craft like PC-1139 understood that reality every single time general quarters sounded. On February 7, 1943, that danger came from an unexpected direction. Douglas's crew picked up a sonar contact consistent with an enemy submarine nearby. The ship moved into position to attack, and a crewman was ordered to deploy a depth charge marker, a device meant to simply mark the target's location in the water without exploding. Something went catastrophically wrong. Instead of the harmless marker, a live depth charge detonated in the water, far closer to the ship than any safe distance allowed. The explosion lifted the entire vessel violently out of the water. Douglas was thrown hard against the ship's structure by the force of the blast. He suffered serious abdominal injuries in the impact, the kind of internal trauma that doesn't show up as a dramatic, visible wound, but that can quietly do damage far more serious than a bullet or shrapnel ever could. While he was recovering in the hospital from those injuries, doctors made a second discovery. Douglas was also suffering from chronic amoebic dysentery, a debilitating parasitic infection that had likely been building in his system for some time. worsened by the stress and conditions of active duty at sea. The combination of the two, the abdominal trauma from the accidental depth charge blast and the dysentery, was severe enough that Navy doctors determined he was no longer fit for continued combat service. In 1944, Douglas was medically discharged at the rank of lieutenant junior grade, his military career over after roughly 3 years, not because of enemy fire, but because of a training accident that should never have happened in the first place. Here is where most tellings of Kirk Douglas's life move on quickly, treating the injury as a footnote on the way to Hollywood. But for Douglas himself, that accident wasn't a footnote. It was something he carried physically and privately for decades. The internal injuries from the blast left him with recurring abdominal pain and digestive complications that resurfaced on and off throughout much of his adult life, long after the Navy discharged him and long after the public had stopped thinking about his military service at all. Unlike some of his fellow actors who leaned into their war records for publicity, Douglas rarely discussed the specifics of what had actually happened aboard that patrol craft, and for years the general public knew only the barest outline. He served in the Navy. He was injured. He came home. After his discharge, Douglas spent months recovering at Balboa Naval Hospital in San Diego, surrounded by other wounded servicemen dealing with injuries that, like his, weren't always visible from the outside. That extended hospital stay reportedly shaped him in ways that went beyond the physical. He later became a genuine, lifelong advocate for wounded veterans, pushing for greater recognition and better care, specifically for sailors and soldiers left with hidden internal injuries, the kind that don't earn a visible scar or a dramatic story, but that quietly follow a person for the rest of their life. It was advocacy rooted directly in his own experience lying in that hospital bed at just 26 years old, wondering what kind of future his damaged body would actually allow him. Once he'd recovered enough to resume his career, Douglas returned to New York and eventually broke into film with The Strange Love of Martha Ivers in 1946. What followed was one of the most decorated careers in Hollywood history. 3 Academy Award nominations, roles in Spartacus, Paths of Glory, Lust for Life, and Gunfight at the OK Corral. He became not just a leading man, but one of the most powerful independent producers in the industry, founding his own production company at a time when actors rarely had that kind of control over their own careers. What almost none of the audiences watching those performances realized was that the man on screen, the one radiating strength and physical intensity in nearly every role he took, was quietly managing the lingering effects of an injury from a war most of them barely remembered him serving in. Douglas didn't build his public persona around his military service the way some of his contemporaries did. He built it around raw ambition, physical presence, and an almost obsessive drive to prove himself, the same drive that had once pulled a shoeless boy out of poverty in Amsterdam, New York. But underneath that drive sat a body that had nearly been torn apart by an accidental explosion in the Pacific before he'd ever set foot on a real film set. It wasn't until later in life, through interviews and his own written memoirs, that Douglas began speaking more openly about the accident and its lasting physical toll, offering a more complete picture of what those 3 years in the Navy had actually cost him. By then, he had already lived an entire additional lifetime as one of the most respected actors in American film history, decades removed from the young ensign who had been thrown against a ship's deck off the California coast. There's something almost ironic buried in that timeline. For most of the 20th century, audiences watched Kirk Douglas play some of the most physically dominant, seemingly indestructible characters in American cinema. Gladiators, gunfighters, boxers, men whose bodies never seemed to fail them no matter what the story threw at them. Few of those audiences had any idea that the actor delivering those performances was managing a chronic internal injury that dated back to a training accident off the California coast, one that had nothing to do with heroism against an enemy and everything to do with a piece of equipment malfunctioning at exactly the wrong moment. Douglas built an entire career on physical invincibility while privately living with proof of exactly how fragile that invincibility could actually be. He survived far more than that single accident over the course of his long life. In 1991, Douglas was involved in a helicopter collision that killed 2 people aboard the other aircraft, leaving him with a fractured spine. In 1996, he suffered a serious stroke that badly affected his speech for years afterward. Through both of those later ordeals, friends and biographers repeatedly pointed back to the same trait, the same stubborn refusal to be defined by physical damage that had first shown itself decades earlier in a hospital bed at Balboa Naval Hospital, as a 26-year-old former ensign wondering whether his body would ever fully recover. Kirk Douglas lived to be 103 years old, passing away on February 5, 2020, having outlived nearly every one of his Hollywood contemporaries and having spent his final decades as one of the last living links to the golden age of American cinema. But long before Spartacus stood defiant in front of a Roman army, before he became one of the most bankable stars in the world, there was a 26-year-old ensign lying on the deck of a small patrol craft off the California coast, carrying an injury he would quietly manage for the rest of his very long life. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more untold histories of the men who lived through history's darkest hours, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.